George Washington's Birthday, a mostly true tale by Margaret McNairy and illustrated by Barry Blitt. When George Washington went to sleep Friday night, he was 6 years old. When he woke up on Saturday, he was 7. It's my birthday, he thought. Happy birthday to me. George went down to breakfast. He peered out the kitchen door and checked the temperature. Another cold day. He said to his mother, "But I guess there's nothing special about that." "Certainly not," she said. "Now eat your porridge, and mind the baby. Porridge is like oatmeal." Does anyone like oatmeal? I do too. Fact: George cared a lot about the weather, and later in life recorded temperatures in his diary every day. In this book, there's going to be facts and myths on most of the pages. A fact means something is true, and a myth is a false belief. After breakfast, George went to the library for his morning lessons. "Get to work, George," said his half-brother Augustine. "I am working," said George. "And don't blot your copybook." "Tyrant," muttered George under his breath. George was usually very good at arithmetic, but not this morning. Fact: George did not go to school regularly. Instead, he took some lessons from a teacher nearby, and may also have been taught by his older half-brother Augustine, who had been schooled in England. And yes, George was usually very good at arithmetic. Augustine marked his paper. "All wrong," he said with a sigh. "You'll never amount to anything. Someday I'll be the boss of you," said George, but he made sure his brother couldn't hear. George gave up on his lessons and went outside to visit the horses. He patted his father's old dray. She snorted at him. "When I'm older, I'll ride a horse even bigger than you," said George. He imagined what he would name his horse when he got older. Then George noticed how cold it was. "I bet I'm turning blue," he thought. The names he thought of was Lightning, Charger, Snow. What names would you name your horse? What name would you give it? And has anyone ever rode a horse before? Me too. They're fun. Fact: George was over 6 feet tall when he grew up, and he rode very tall horses too. One of his favorite horses was called Blueskin. To warm himself up, George tossed stones into the river. Some birthday. "Toss this is," George said. A friend of his brother strode by. "Bet you can't throw one of those all the way across the river," said the young man. "Bet I can," said George. He screwed up his eyes and made a birthday wish. Then he leaned back, wound up, and threw the stone all the way to the other side of the Rappahannock River. "Lordy, that's pretty good for a 6-year-old," said the young man, and he ran off. George was so peeved at being called a 6-year-old that he tried to toss another stone across the river. It sank before it got halfway over. Myth: after George died, the legend grew up that he was so strong he would be able to throw a stone across the Rappahannock River, but that would have been very hard to do. The Rappahannock ran alongside the Washington family farm, but where George lived, the river was about 200 feet across. Does anyone like to throw stones across the river, like George? Yeah. Have you ever tried? No? By the time he got home, George was cold and grumpy and ready for some sweet tea by the fire. He waved to his father, working in the orchard. "Glad to see you, son," said George's father. "You can help me prune these cherry trees." "But, Papa," George began. "Fetch a hatchet," his father said. George fetched a hatchet. He hacked off old tree branches. It was hard work. His hand ached. His back was sore. This was no way to spend a birthday, thought George. I'm so mad I could just... What do you think he's gonna do? Let's find out. He cut down the tree. Was he supposed to? No. Do you think his father's gonna be mad? George's father strode over to his son. Who did this? He asked. Though George thought the answer must be pretty obvious. Don't you know what day it is? Asked George. It's Saturday, said his father, and I'd advise you to think before you speak again. George figured he'd better confess. Father, said George at last, I could not tell a lie. It was I who chopped down the tree. George always used his best grammar when he was in trouble. His father sighed. I'm glad you told the truth, son, he said. George started to smile. But I am not happy about this tree. George stopped smiling. I suppose you better chop it up now that the damage is done, his father said, and put it in the woodshed to dry. Myth. This story about George is just a legend too, but George was always a very truthful man, so people like to believe it is true. The woodshed was across a little creek from the cherry orchard. Back and forth, George carried the heavy loads of wood, crossing the icy creek each time. What? I did forget to show you the picture. Thank you. The woodshed was across the little creek from the cherry orchard. Back and forth, George carried the heavy loads of wood, crossing the icy creek each time. Hope I never have to do this again, he said to himself. Fact. In one of the most important battles of the Revolutionary War, George had to cross the Delaware River many times in boats, carrying very heavy loads in order to defeat the British. I almost forgot again. Thank you for reminding me. At last he finished his work. Now clean your face and hands and powder your wig and occupy yourself gainfully until dinner time, said his father. Myth. Many people believe that George Washington wore a wig, but he did not. When he got older, he powdered his white hair to make himself look more distinguished. George went to his bedroom. He got out a piece of paper and started writing, but George wasn't sure what his father would call gainful occupation. He wrote, Be it known that in good time my birthday will be held and celebrated at a grand and elegant dinner attended by multitudes and... Fact. Almost 100 years after George turned 7, his birthday was commemorated by his friend General Lafayette at a grand and elegant dinner in Washington, D.C. So he thought and he came up with some other ideas he believed his father would like. He wrote, Think before you speak. When you sit down, keep your feet firm and even. Keep your nails clean and short. If you cough, sneeze, sigh, or yawn, do it not loud. Fact. George really did write a list he called 110 Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, and these are some of his actual rules. He carried the list around with him to help him remember how to be a gentleman. He probably did not start writing the rules when he was 7 years old, but by the age of 16 he had written them all. He worked so hard on his list that he did not hear the bell for dinner. George, called his mother, get down here at once. George hurried down the stairs. When he opened the door to the dining room, he got a mighty surprise. What do you think the surprise is going to be? What day was it again? His birthday, that's right. Happy birthday, George, said his family. The family sat down to dinner and had a grand feast in honor of the birthday boy. I thought you all had forgotten, said George, His mother gave him a squeeze. "How could anyone forget your birthday, George Washington?" she said. "Oh, Mama," said George, "you only say that because you're my mother." Fact. The Washingtons would not have thrown a party for George, but they might have had a large family dinner on his birthday. How do you celebrate your birthday? You have a party, you go out and eat with your family. Awesome. But to tell the truth, nobody did forget George Washington's birthday ever again. And his birthday is on February 22nd. George Washington tells the truth. The story you just read is fiction. That means it was made up. But there is a lot that's true in this story, so I'm going to see the facts straight. When I was 7, I lived on the banks of Rappahannock River in Virginia. I had 2 half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, a younger sister, Betty, and 3 younger brothers, Samuel, John, and baby Charles. You don't see Lawrence in the story because he was living in England at the time. It's true I was a serious little boy. I was very interested in the weather and in the landscape around our house, and in my lessons, of course. I did write out 110 rules to live by, and I kept them with me as I grew older. I rode horses almost all my life, and they did have the names Charger, Lightning, Snow, and Blueskin. I commanded the American soldiers as they traveled by ferry back and forth across the river. I was a general in the Revolutionary War, and I became the first president of the United States. When I was 7 years old, I didn't know that any of that would happen. I got to be such an important leader that lots of myths grew up about me. Teachers and parents used me as an example of how really good children should behave. The story about how I threw a rock or a silver dollar across the river was told to show how strong I was. I was strong, but not that strong. In 1800, a preacher named Mason Locke Weems wrote a book called The Life of George Washington. Parson Weems made up the story about the cherry tree for his book to show my goodness and virtue. It's funny to think that a story about the truth was actually not true. Nowadays, my birthday is a holiday called President's Day. Banks, post offices, and schools are closed on the 3rd Monday of February to celebrate. But when I was born, it was just a cold February day. In fact, we used a different calendar back then. So according to that calendar, I was born on February 11th, 1732. When we changed our calendar, it was very confusing, and my birthday moved to February 22nd, 1732. I suppose my mama was right. Nobody forgets my birthday anymore.